We had a small break in our lesson. It is now a day later from when I started this. I had an interruption yesterday when I was in the middle of this next section that we talked about. And so I'm going to pick up again today with where we had left off. Picking up now with verse 26 of chapter 9. When Gaal, son of Ebed, moved into Shechem with his kinsfolk, the lords of Shechem put confidence in him. They went out into the field and gathered the grapes from their vineyards, trod them, and celebrated. Then they went into the temple of their god, ate and drank, and ridiculed Abimelech. Gaal, son of Ebed, said, "Who is Abimelech, and who are we of Shechem, that we should serve him? Did not the son of Jerubbaal and Zebul, his officer, serve the men of Hamor, father of Shechem? Why then should we serve him? If only this people were under my command, then I would remove Abimelech, and I would say to him, 'Increase your army, come out.'" Well, we have a new character introduced into our story, and that is the man named Gaal, and he's the son of Ebed. Now, we need to understand his name is probably a moniker that was attached to him later, after the story was, after this incident took place. Because Gaal means despised or despicable, something along that line. And Ebed is slave. It's the Hebrew word for slave. So the despicable, the despised son of a slave moved into Shechem with his kinsfolk. The lords of Shechem put confidence in him. So we have this outsider. He's not a Hebrew. He is a Canaanite. In fact, he is from the kinsfolk of the original inhabitants of this place. As the story progresses, you see that here. So he moved into Shechem with a bunch of his other kinsfolk, and the people there, the lords of Shechem, kind of like this guy, and they put him, and they decide to put him in charge. So then they want to celebrate this, so they go out in the field, they gather some grapes from the vineyard, they crush out the grapes, and they celebrate it. It's interesting is that it seems like if that's what they did, then they weren't drinking wine, they were drinking grape juice, because you can't ferment wine overnight or even in a day. So it's either that or they replaced the stock for what they drank, but they ate and drank, and while they were doing that, they ridiculed Abimelech. So then Gaal, the despised here, the despicable son of the slave, said, "Who is Abimelech, and who are we of Shechem, that we should serve him?" So who is this fellow that we're following? He's not even one of us. He's not even part of us. So who are we of Shechem that we should follow this guy? Didn't this guy here, this son of Jerubbaal and Zebul, his officer, serve the men of Hamor, father of Shechem? And again, so didn't they serve as didn't they at one time served Hamor, who was the founder of Shechem, the founder of the city? You can find this story. Now, this is really an interesting story. And again, we'll talk about Shechem. I will bring out a whole bunch of information about Shechem at the end of this video. I will give you, it's probably a good 5 or 10 minutes of just about Shechem that I have prepared. And so I will attach that to the end of this. And again, this will be just kind of for your information as we are here. But if you were to look at this story, we could go back to Genesis, and we would see where Gaal has taken this knowledge or this information. That Hamor at one time was the king of this city Shechem, and his son, who was named Shechem after him. So, or after the city. So we'll come back to that. So why should we serve him? I mean, at one time we served the people that made these people serve. And then he goes on to make a claim. If only these people were under my command. If only you all and the army here, the military forces here, if you were under my command, then I would remove Abimelech, and I would say to him, "Increase your army and come out." I would taunt him into, "Build up your army, bring me a bigger army to fight against me, and I'll come out against you." Picking up now with verse 30. When Zebul, the ruler of the city, heard the words of Gaal, son of Ebed, his anger was kindled. He sent messengers to Abimelech at Arumah, saying, Look, Gaal, son of Ebed, and his kinsfolk have come to Shechem, and they are stirring up the city against you. Now therefore, go by night, you and the troops that are with you, and lie in wait in the fields. Then early in the morning, as soon as the sun rises, get up and rush on the city, and when he and the troops that are with him come out against you, you may deal with them as best you can. So, just to make the situation clearer, we find out that here at this point that Abimelech lives in a town called Arumah, which is a little distance away, and he has left Zebul as the governor of this city. And so Zebul, although he's the governor of the city appointed by Abimelech to lead that city, he hears the words of what Gaal, the son of Ebed, is saying, and he gets upset by this because he's been left in charge, and this guy Gaal is kind of undermining his authority, and not only Zebul's authority, but he's also talking against Abimelech, who Zebul had been appointed by. And so he sends a messenger to Abimelech in the town where he's staying, in Arumah, and he lets him know what's going on, is that Gaal has showed up along with a whole bunch of his family and his kinsfolk. They've come to Shechem, and they're kind of taking over the city. They're stirring up trouble against you. So he tells him, pretty much, he gives him a battle plan. He says, why don't you come up in the night and hide and wait, and when the sun rises, as soon as everybody goes out to eat, come on in and rush the city and take over and reconquer this city, retake this city. And so, and when you do that, that way you can deal with this problem as best you can. Picking up now with verse 34. So Abimelech and all the troops with him got up by night and lay in wait against Shechem in 4 companies. When Gaal, son of Ebed, went out and stood in the entrance of the gate of the city, Abimelech and the troops with him rose from the ambush. And when Gaal saw them, he said to Zebul, Look, people are coming down from the mountaintops. And Zebul said to him, The shadows on the mountain look like people to you. Gaal spoke again and said, Look, people are coming down from Tabur Erez, and one company is coming from the direction of Elon Meonanim. Then Zebul said to him, Where is your boast now, you who said, Who is Abimelech, that we should serve him? Are not these the troops you made light of? Go out now and fight with them. So Gaal went out at the head of the lords of Shechem and fought with Abimelech. Abimelech chased him, and he fled before him. Many fell wounded up to the entrance of the gate. So Abimelech resided at Arumah, and Zebul drove out Gaal and his kinsfolk, so that they could not live on at Shechem. Okay, so Abimelech sets this ambush, this trap, and he's laying in wait just outside the gates of Shechem, and actually he's up on a hilltop, and he's coming from 4 different directions. We find out then that Gaal, along with Zebul, have gone for a morning walk. And Gaal has come out, and he's standing at the entrance to the gate of the city. And at the same time that he steps out and is kind of looking out over the countryside outside the gates of the city, Abimelech and his troops, they rise up for their ambush. And Gaal sees them, and he leans over to Zebul, and he says to him, Look, people are coming down from the mountaintops. And he's kind of excited about this because he thinks he sees people coming down. He sees the troops coming. But Zebul, in maybe, now remember, Zebul is on the other side. He's not on Gaal's side. He is on Abimelech's side. So Zebul looks at him and says, Man, you're seeing shadows on the mountain and you think they're people. You're being paranoid here. So Gaal's then, although by this time Gaal has also noticed that people are coming down from Tabur Erez, and they're also coming from the direction of Elon Meonanim. And he tells, and so he says, well, they're coming from these other two directions too. And here is where Zebul then pretty much lets him know what's going on. And he tells him, "Where's your boast now? You boasted earlier that if Abimelech shows up, that you would taunt him into raising a greater army. So here he is. Here's the troops you've made light of. So why don't you go out now and go fight them?" So he gathers the lords of the army quickly. Now, so he's been taunted into doing this. What he should have done, what he honestly should have done if he was going to be a leader of this town, of this community, of this city, then he should have actually retreated into the city, barred the gates, and got his troops ready for an excursion to go out and then push the Abimelech's troops away. But that's not what he does. Instead, he hurriedly gets together his lords and his army, or his troops, and they go out to fight. And they go out and fight with Abimelech and his troops. Well, Abimelech is faster and smarter and stronger, and he chases him, and Gael then runs. And they make it almost all the way to the gates of the city, to the entrance of the city, but they're pretty much wiped out. And at that point, Zebul now really does control Shechem again. And so Abimelech moves back to Arumah. He goes back home to his town, and Zebul finishes off this battle by driving the rest of Gael's kinsfolk out of town. And drove them out and made it impossible for them to live there in that town. Verse 42. On the following day, the people went out into the fields. When Abimelech was told, he took his troops and divided them into 3 companies and lay in wait in the fields. When he looked and saw the people coming out of the city, he rose against them and killed them. Abimelech and the company that was with him rushed forward and stood at the entrance of the gate of the city, while the 2 companies rushed on all who were in the fields and killed them. Abimelech fought against the city all that day. He took the city and killed the people that were in it, and he razed the city and sowed it with salt. So after Zebul has driven out Gael's kinsfolk, and they've driven them out and pretty much secured the city, the next morning, the story tells us, the following day, the people then, like nothing has ever happened, they go out into the field and start working their fields. And so this gives Abimelech an opportunity here to finish off the justice, or his vengeance on what's going on here. It gives him an opportunity to complete his vengeance. And so he hears this. He hears that they've started going back to being normal again. They've gone back into the fields, and they've started harvesting grain and doing what they normally would always do anyway. They've gone back to being a normal city again. And so that gives him opportunity for his vengeance. He looks up, and so he, shortly thereafter, it kind of makes us the impression that this was all happening on the next day, but the next day is the day that he found this out. And so then he sets up this ambush, and it could have been a couple of days, it could have been a week, it could be a little bit later, maybe even enough for the people to kind of settle into, okay, everything's gone back to normal, and we don't have to worry about anything. But Abimelech has a plan. So he sets up another ambush, and this time he sets it up with 3 troops instead of 4. He divides his company up into 3 companies, and they lay in wait in the field. And as soon as the people come out to go out and harvest, Abimelech and his 3 companies of troops, they rush forward, and they block between, and they stand between the gates of the city and the fields where the people are working. Now we need to recognize that these would be the common people. These would be just the ordinary people of the city. These wouldn't be the lords. These wouldn't be the hierarchy of the city. This wouldn't be the city administrators. This would simply be the peasant folk, the common people that lived in this town, that they've gone out to work and to gather grain and to do their normal routine. And Abimelech comes in with his 2 companies, and he rushes out into the field, and he kills off all of those that are in the field. These were all just common folk that he kills off. And so then he goes back and he attacks the city. So he sends 2 troops out into the field to kill off all those people. Meanwhile, he has gone in with his 3rd troop, and he's gone into the city, and he started the killing there. The killing and the pillaging and the razing of the city there. And then the other troops, of course, would join in as soon as they finished out in town, and they would come in and start killing the people that lived in the town. And again, these would be the merchants, the common folk again. These would not be the lords, the leadership of the city. They would have a place of refuge, as we will find in the next section of this story. So he fights against the city all that day. He finally takes the city. He kills everybody. Again, he does a haram, which is which is a complete wiping out of everybody that lives in the city. But my guess is he probably did not wipe out all the animals and so forth. But maybe he did. Maybe he made an example of this city. It does says he kills all the people. He razed the city, and then he sowed it with salt. And that was, again, not a very uncommon thing. That mostly happened when the enemy was so bitter that you wanted to completely make their land where they lived unlivable. And you salt the soil, and it can no longer grow crops. And that's what Abimelech did. Verse 46. When all the lords of the tower of Shechem heard of it, they entered the stronghold of the temple of El-Berith. Abimelech was told that all the lords of the tower of Shechem were gathered together. So Abimelech went up to Mount Zalmon, he and all the troops that were with him. Abimelech took an axe in his hand, cut down a bundle of brushwood, and took it up and laid it on his shoulder. Then he said to the troops with him, "Whatever you have seen me do, do quickly, as I have done." So every one of the troops cut down a bundle and followed Abimelech, put it against the stronghold, and they set the stronghold on fire over them, so that all the people of the tower of Shechem also died, about 1,000 men and women. So as our story progresses here, we find out here that just like I had spoken earlier, the common folk are all dead, and all we have left are the lords, the hierarchy of the community, of the town, and their families and so forth. And maybe even their aristocratic neighbors or their wealthy neighbors. It wasn't just the lords, but all the wealthy of the town, all the people who had some status other than being common. They go into the temple stronghold. Again, this is not an uncommon thing to happen, that there would be a temple to some god. In this case here it's Baal. They would have a temple to their god, and inside that temple there would be a place, or near that temple there would be a place where all of the lords, all of the wealthy, all of those of the higher class, with a higher status, would be able to go and refuge themselves in, or hide themselves in. And so they all gather together, and they go hide in this hiding place, in this place of sanctuary. So Abimelech, in order to fix this problem, he goes up to Mount Zalmon. Now, Zalmon means dark, or darkness, and so it's the Mount of Darkness, or dark. Now, what is truly interesting is that this is actually Mount Ebal, the Mount of Curses. In comparison again to Mount Gerizim at the southern end of the valley, Mount Ebal, known here as Mount Zalmon, Mount Darkness, is on the north end of the valley, and Gerizim is on the south end of the valley, and Shechem is located at the foot of Gerizim at the south end of the valley. So the valley of Jezreel. So Abimelech has gone up onto Mount Ebal, the Mount of Curses, Mount Zalmon, the Mount of Darkness. It's all the same place. And he takes all of his troops with him, and he takes an axe and he cuts down a whole bunch of wood. He takes a whole bunch of brushwood, or bundles of brushwood, and he picks it up, and then he tells his troops, "Do what I have done." And so all of his troops go out and they cut down bundles, and they all carrying wood. and they take it to the stronghold and they set the fire on it. Again, I want to remind you of the prophecy way back when, where stone and fire play a part. And here we have the fire again, that the fire coming out of Abimelech, as the prophecy said, is that he is creating the fire over them. And they all die in the tower. They all die. And I kind of see this as that he's built this pyre, or he's piled all of this wood, and it's not on the edge of the tower around the outside where they just kind of like this, but he's actually put it on top of where they're all hiding. And what would that do is, they would not burn to death. You just need to know that. They would probably not burn to death. What they would do is they would suffocate. Because as the fire burns, it would suck all the oxygen out of the cave that they're in. It would suck all of the atmosphere out of the place where they're staying and hiding, and they would end up just going to sleep because of the lack of oxygen, and they would all suffocate in that way. So that's how Abimelech finally finishes Shechem and all of its residents. But he's not finished. Picking up with verse 50. Then Abimelech went to Thebez, and encamped against Thebez, and took it. But there was a strong tower within the city, and all the men and women and all the lords of the city fled to it, and shut themselves in. And they went to the roof of the tower. Abimelech came to the tower, and fought against it, and came near to the entrance of the tower to burn it with fire. But a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head, and crushed his skull. Immediately he called to the young man who carried his armor, and said to him, "Draw your sword and kill me, so people will not say about me, a woman killed him." So the young man thrust him through, and he died. When the Israelites saw that Abimelech was dead, they all went home. Thus God repaid Abimelech for the crime he committed against his father in killing his 70 brothers. And God also made all the wickedness of the people of Shechem fall back on their heads, and on them came the curse of Jotham, son of Jerubbaal. So here we have Abimelech is going to a nearby town. Now, maybe this nearby town was also under the control of Shechem. It was kind of like a lot of time a city-state would have one major city, and then they would have small villages or towns that would be nearby that the major city would also be under control of, and so they would control an area. And so he goes to this nearby town, and he camps against it, and he takes the town. Well, again, there was a strong tower in the city of Thebez, and the lords of the city and the men and the women of the city that and it's probably again the upper class flee, and they shut themselves into this tower, and they go up onto the roof. So Abimelech comes to the tower and fights against it, and as he finally fights his way so that he's near the entrance to the tower, he's going to do exactly what he had done in Shechem. He's going to burn them out. And so he starts to, he's at the entrance of the tower, and he's starting to try to burn it with fire. But a woman throws a millstone up. It says an upper millstone. Now, just kind of a reference point here is that a mill like this would have two stones. You'd have a base stone, and it would have a groove in it like this. And then you would have an upper stone, which would be 6 to 18 inches big, depending on the size of the base stone. And again, who's going to do this? Milling grain, grinding like this was usually done by slaves, and by women, and so it would not. So it's very appropriate that a woman would take this 6 to 18 inch stone that she was using, and again, the outside of the stone it'd be a round stone with kind of a convex to it, so it would fit into the groove of the concave bottom stone. And so she picks this stone up and she throws it off the top of the tower, and it falls and it smacks Abimelech on the head, and it cracks his skull. So he calls for his armor bearer to come over and to kill him, because he doesn't want to be known that he was killed by a woman. So he's thrust through and he dies, and when Israel sees that Abimelech is dead, everybody just goes home. The war's over, everybody just goes home. And again, we talked about this once before, that when the leader dies, if the leader of the army dies, is that a lot of times the army just kind of disintegrates and falls away, and they all just go back home. And so they all go back home, and in this way God repaid Abimelech for killing his 70 brothers. And he also this also paid Shechem back for their part in that murder, in that genocide of his family. And so all the people, what it wants to, at the end of this, it tells us that Jotham's curse comes true, that the prophet's curse came true. And what is the sign of a prophet? What is the sign of a true prophet? That anything that they prophesy that comes true makes them a true prophet. And so Jotham was a true prophet of God, and Abimelech was a true enemy of God. That is how the story is settled. I want to bring to mind here that Abimelech didn't. He had his armor bearer kill him so that he wouldn't be known as someone who was killed by a woman. There is only one other place where the Abimelech story is brought up in context in the Bible. There's only one other place where this story is actually brought out and mentioned. David has had an affair with Bathsheba, and he sent a message to Boaz to have Bathsheba's husband, the Hittite, come to be in the heat of the battle, so he'll be killed, and that way nobody will know that David had an affair with Bathsheba, because she's pregnant, and so he has him killed. And Boaz sends a message back to David, telling him, writes him a letter, tells him, and he tells the servant that's with him, or that delivers the messenger that delivers the message, if King David is upset by hearing that we've lost some troops here at this battle, to let him know that the Hittite is dead, and that as he came too close to the tower, he was killed. And at that moment, David reminds or tells the servant, go back to Boaz and tell him not to worry about this, but remind him of the story of Abimelech, of how they came too close to the tower and that a woman killed the leader. And so David is the only, and again, David is the only place in all of Scripture where the Abimelech story is used as an example, and it's an example of exactly the opposite of what Abimelech wanted. Abimelech did not want to be known as someone who was killed by a woman, and that is exactly how he is known in later times, as someone who was killed by a woman. This also reminds us of a previous story, and this is really important to this story, is that if you remember the story of Jael, how the woman, how Jael, this woman of no importance, kills the king and ends the war. And here we have another example of where a woman who has absolutely no status, and yet she ends this war by killing the king. And so again, it's just kind of an interesting little tidbit of mess that has been created here, and Abimelech has suffered for it. This is a little extra to the class, and again, you may skip this if you wish, but this is kind of it's the importance of Shechem in our biblical story, and in the context of the Bible, how important Shechem really is. It's located in the hill country of Ephraim. It's in the middle of Israel, located kind of centrally located to the entire nation. and it has one of the most important crossroads in all of central Israel. It's at the northern end of the Way of the Patriarchs. The road is also known as the Ridge Route because it follows along one of the key mountain ridges, and it's about a 50 miles stretch. Traveling from Shechem, you would go through Shiloh, Bethel, which is also known as Ai, Ramah, Gibeah, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Hebron. That's kind of the path that you would, if you were to follow it. And this route appears, this route that we're talking about appears quite often in biblical texts. We'll find it as you move through Scripture. You'll find a lot of roads lead to Shechem. There are crossroads at Shechem that offered a direction that led off in 3 different directions. Along with, in addition to the ridge route leading south, the road also passed through Shechem on the northeastern side of Mount Gerizim, just south of Mount Ebal, which we've talked about in the class or during this lesson. So the road was forced. So the road kind of forces you to pass through the city located between these 2 mountains, which is Shechem. From there, the road descends into the Sharon Plain, reaching into the international highway, the Via Maris, at Sukkot. The 3rd road from Shechem leads northeast along the Wadi Biden to Tarza, where it kind of goes down into the Jordan Valley via the Wadi Faria. Ultimately, or at the end, the road passes through the Jabbok Valley. This is Midnight, one of the new kittens. It leads where it goes down into the Jordan Valley via this particular Wadi. Eventually, the road passes through the Jabbok Valley and reaches the Transjordan Highway. Because of its central location and the crossroads that come there, it has a lot of traffic in our history, and so you find Shechem often is it's at the center of a lot of the narratives out of our Bible. Shechem first walks into our stories as Abram enters the land of Canaan from Ur. From across the Fertile Crescent and down into Canaan. The Scripture mentions Shechem as the first city that Abram comes to, and that's in Genesis chapter 12, verse 6. Abram builds an altar to God there, and God confirms his promise to give that land to Abram. If he would have gone up on top of Mount Gerizim or climbed to the top of Mount Ebal, on either one of those 2, and if he would have overlooked, he would have seen pretty much all of the Promised Land. Pretty much the horizon, all the way to the horizon, is nothing but the Promised Land. And so the area in Canaan where Abram spent most of his life were along this route of the patriarchs, namely in Shechem, chapter 12, verse 6 of Genesis, Bethel and Ai in chapter 12, verse 8, and chapter 13, verse 2, in Hebron, chapter 13, verse 18, and 14:13, and in the Negev. All of these are all along this, and most notably that was in Gerar, and that's in chapter 13, verse 1, and also in chapter 20, verse 1. So you see that Abram has a lot of time spent in and around Shechem. Abram's grandson, Jacob, comes to Shechem when he returns back from Padan Aram, his visit with his uncle there. When he comes back, he follows his grandfather and ends up traveling through the Jabbok Valley, crosses the Jordan, he camps at Sukkoth, and then he ascends, then he goes down through the Wadi Faria and on to Shechem. At this point here in the biblical story, Jacob is renamed Israel there at the Jabbok, and he builds an altar, and he names it El Eloi Israel, meaning God, the God of Israel. And here also Jacob digs a well for his herds. and the well, according to our tradition and according to modern history even, the well is still there. Well, while Jacob was living in Shechem, Jacob's daughter Dinah was raped by a man named Shechem, the son of the ruler Hamor. Remember, I told you about that story as we were getting through that when Gaal, the bad guy in that particular story, I reminded you then, because he reminded them, are we, the Canaanites here, not descended from Hamor, and wasn't his son named Shechem right here after this city? So Shechem rapes Dinah, and he is the son of the king of Shechem, Hamor. And that's when Levi and Simon come together. They make a pact with each other, and well, they make a pact with the males of the city. And if you remember that story, it was that if you all, we will join with you. If you all get circumcised, then we will join with you. Your tribe will become our tribe will be yours. Our families will join. We will all be one people. Well, that's what they proposed to them, and the men of Shechem agreed to that, and the idea was that in order for them to join us and all of that, they had to be circumcised. And so the men of that agreed, the men of Shechem agreed to that, and while they were in pain from their circumcisions, them all being adult men, Levi and Simon go in there and kill everybody, and they wipe out the city, all in revenge for Dinah. Well, as time progresses, years later, Jacob's 17-year-old son Joseph leaves Hebron, goes from Hebron to check on his brothers, and who were keeping their flocks in Shechem. That's in Genesis chapter 37. Well, Joseph arrives, and undoubtedly following the ridge route, which we've already discussed, he finds his two brothers. He finds out that his brothers have moved on to a different town, Dothan. So he goes and finds them in Genesis chapter 37. Well, his brothers are very angry at him. They really hate him. Remember, he's the dreamer. He's the one that keeps telling them that eventually they're going to have to bow down to him. And so they sell him to an Ishmaelite trader who's coming through the Dothan Pass, headed to Egypt via the Via Maris, the same road that goes through Shechem. So, of course, God uses that event to eventually move the entire family to Egypt and protecting them so that they can multiply and grow there. Well, Joseph himself, his last memories of Israel before his brothers sell him into slavery was of Shechem and Dothan. So he believed that God would one day return the nation to Canaan. And so he gave the command, Joseph gave the command that his bones were to be carried back to Israel, back to Shechem, and buried there. And we find that in Genesis chapter 50. Moving forward again, after Moses, so we move forward again, the Israelites are taken into bondage, and Moses comes along and he brings them out of that bondage. And God commands Israel to enter the promised land, to go to Shechem, to pronounce the blessings and the curses of the covenant on the nation. And we find that in Deuteronomy chapter 27. Joshua did this. Remember, the command was given to Moses, but Moses wasn't allowed to go into the promised land. So then that command that they go to Shechem, to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, fell on Joshua to take care of that. So Joshua does this. He divides the nation in half. I talked about this not that long ago. He divides the nation in half, 6 on one hill, 6 on the other. Half of them go up Mount Gerizim, the other half go up Mount Ebal. And we find this in Joshua chapter 8. From Mount Ebal, they shout down the curses if they disobey the law, and from Mount Gerizim, they shout down the blessings if they obey the law. And there on Mount Ebal, Joshua builds an altar to God, and on a pillar of stones, he writes a copy of the law. Now we can find that in Joshua chapter 8. That's kind of that's one of those little obscure things that most of you probably don't realize or don't know, was that when he got there, he was to build an altar to God and then put this pile of stones there also, which he writes a copy of the law. That's not in your normal teaching. That is something different. I mean, we've always kind of like, oh well, it's Moses, the only one who ever wrote down the law. Well, we find out that Joshua did this also. He wrote a copy down and left it there with that pillar of stones. Well, after the end of the conquest, Joshua gathers the whole nation of Shechem again together again, or he gathers the whole nation to Shechem at the end of the conquest and reminds them of their previous pledge. And so again, Shechem plays a very central role in the initial conquest of Israel, of their blessings, of the curses, of the promises, and of the covenant. Shechem holds a very important spot in all of that. And so he sits, and so when he does this joining together in Joshua chapter 24, he sets up another stone in Shechem, and he says, "This stone shall be a witness against us, for it has heard all the words of the Lord which he has spoken to us. Thus it shall be a witness against you, lest you deny your God." Now I want to remind you that the tower in Shechem, that this could actually be that stone that he's placed up there to mark and to commemorate the covenant with God. Well, Joseph is the father of, moving forward, Joseph is the father of Ephraim and Manasseh. And so Joshua buried the bones of Joseph, which the sons of Israel brought up from Egypt at Shechem, in the piece of ground which Jacob had bought from the sons of Hamor, and they became the inheritance of Joseph's sons. Part of the reason why all of this is happening around Shechem isn't just that it's centrally located, but it was also part of the gift, the original gift to Joseph, and that Joseph actually purchased. Jacob had purchased the piece of land to bury family on, and they still owned it. And so Joseph is buried with his ancestors there. And they already, in some sense, already believed or already held that they owned that city. Well, Joshua then also designates Shechem as a city of refuge, and that's it is centrally located. It is one of the three centers of refuge, which is on the west side of the Jordan. There's only three, and it's a city of refuge is if you were to kill somebody, you could run to the city of refuge and find refuge there while they settled the dispute of to why and how and should you have killed this person. If you don't go to a city of refuge, the brother or the avenger for that family can go and hunt you down and kill you in response to you killing somebody in their family. But if you run to a city of refuge, you have an opportunity to survive all of this. Judgment is called, and if you're found guilty, you must stay in that city. It just becomes a city, and it becomes a city where you are protected. So it's designated as a city of refuge, and is one of the three cities of refuge that's on the western side of the Jordan. We'll find that in Joshua chapter 20, Joshua chapter 21, and also in 1 Chronicles chapter 6. You'll also see a mention of Shechem as being one of the sanctuary cities. Well, as we just witnessed in this lesson, Judges chapter 9, the next stage that we meet or that we come into contact with Shechem is the story of Abimelech, the son of Gideon, where he conspired with his mother's family, who were from Shechem, to kill all the other sons of Gideon and have himself proclaimed king of Shechem. That's Judges 9:6. But Jotham, the youngest son of Gideon, escapes by hiding at Abimelech's coronation. Jotham climbed Mount Gerizim and shouted a curse on Shechem for Abimelech's sin. The curse, of course, proves true, because the the citizens of Shechem, they form a conspiracy against Abimelech, and so Abimelech comes back and destroys the city. But of course, when he goes and storms the tower of Thebez, he's killed by the woman who drops the millstone on his head. Judges chapter 9, verse 53. Well, so now we move forward, and under the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon, Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, they all go to Shechem, for all of Israel came to Shechem to make them kings. Shechem is the place where kings are made. Interesting, isn't it? That the first one that's made there is Abimelech, and he's kind of a false king. He's not a king. He's not a king given to them from God. He's a king raised up from them, from the Canaanites and from the Israelites that have become like Canaanites in their belief and in how they act. So, but Shechem is the place where kings go to be anointed, to be made the king. And and we find that in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1. Well, but because Rehoboam followed the foolish and stupid advice from some of the young folk that he was hanging out with and that he grew up with, the nation ends up at this point becoming divided, and Jeroboam shouts out, "To your tents, O Israel," because Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, is now in charge of the south, and Jeroboam has broken with that and called on the northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes, to fight against, to separate from the southern tribes. That's found in 1 Kings chapter 12. Well, because Jerusalem was the only appointed place that God was allowing for worship to happen, and Jerusalem was inside Judah, Jeroboam sets up a rival sanctuary in Bethel, complete with a golden bull for an image of Yahweh. Well, this rival religious center allows the northern tribes to worship without crossing the border into Judah. Well, this this city of idols, this idol center was south of Shechem. That's where Bethel is, and that's where their forefathers of Joshua made the covenant to worship God alone. That's in 1 Kings chapter 12. Well, Jeroboam, when he establishes his kingdom of the northern tribes, he establishes Shechem as the capital city. And maybe that's because of its importance to Ephraim. It may be because the significance of Abraham, the city to Abraham, to Jacob, to Joseph, and to Joshua. It had a great spiritual significance to all of those leaders, and it was also along that way of the patriarchs. So it was centrally located, and so it was right along that north-south Transjordan highway. And so it makes a good choice for a capital city. Well, a later king of Israel, Omri, he chooses Samaria as the capital because it was easier to defend than Shechem. It had steep slopes, and it was on a high hill, and so it would also house about 40,000 people. So it becomes the new capital. Well, it also required cisterns of water, which was a drawback because of sieges and things like that. And it was also a little bit off the beaten path. It was 5 to 6 miles off the international highway. And so that was also an asset, I guess, in some ways because of sieges. Well, it was also conveniently on the road to Shechem. Samaria enjoyed a lot of produce, and since the valley nearby, the Dothan Plain, was very fertile, and this all made Samaria an ideal place for a capital. Because it was close to Shechem, it was also close to the very fertile areas where crops and stuff could grow. And it was along one of the major highways, and so it was easy to get to the highway, although it was off the beaten path enough that it made it difficult to be sieged against. So it becomes one of the capital cities of the north. Now, just again, side note here is that the capital city moves. It moves from Shechem to Samaria, from Samaria to Penuel. It's also in Penuel. It's also in Tirzah. There are 3 different locations, or 4 different locations for where the capital city is. It ends up being Samaria for the most of the time, including all the way into Jesus' day. Well, Samaria becomes significant in Shechem's history because the people there later worship on Mount Gerizim, and it came to be known, the people of the northern tribes there, whose capital city is Samaria, they become known as Samaritans, and because of the capital that Omri had selected of Samaria. Well, after the Assyrians come in and drag the northern kingdom off into exile in 772 or 722 BC, they moved people back into this region. They were Assyrians. They were partly Jewish, partly Assyrian, partly mixed of other peoples that the Assyrians had conquered, and they settled a whole bunch of people in this region. And these people didn't really know Adonai, and so the northern kingdom continuously struggled with idolatry. Well, when Judah returned from exile to their portion of the nation, down into Judea, down in the southern region here, the Samaritans they asked to help, if they could, to help rebuild the temple in Samaria or in Jerusalem. They really wanted to kind of settle the differences between the 2 kingdoms that had been there, the 2 different peoples. And so when Judah comes back, they ask, can we come and help? But Zerubbabel, who was the king of Judah, refused, and he wouldn't let them. And so the Samaritans developed their own cultic system, they devoted themselves only to the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They ignored the rest of the Tanakh, and they only focused on those first 5 books. And they built their own temple on top of Mount Gerizim, which of course is sitting right next to Shechem. And so they developed their own cultic practices. But I remind you that although they didn't practice the same cultic practices as the Jews down in Judea, the Samaritan Jews, or the Samaritans up here, practiced worshiping Yahweh, worshiping Adonai. They just did it differently. And so that becomes an issue later. In fact, they build their own temple on Mount Gerizim, and in 107 BC, which is many, many, many years and years later, John Hyrcanus, he actually helped spread add to the rift between the Jews down in Judea and the Samaritans up in the northern kingdom by destroying the temple on Mount Gerizim. He destroyed the Samaritans' temple. He tore it down. So as time progresses, by the time Jesus speaks, 100 years later, after John Hyrcanus has destroyed it, by the time Jesus comes along and he's sitting at Jacob's well, remember that stays there to this day, even Jesus sat at Jacob's well there that was built there, or that was dug there. Jesus has a conversation with the Samaritan woman near Shechem. And this hatred between the Jews and the Samaritans comes out in the story. And in the argument between the two about where the true place of worship is, Gerizim or on Jerusalem, and their argument was in full force. And we see that, you'll find that in the Gospel of John, chapter 4. I want to thank you for being part of the class today. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope to see you again next week when we look at chapter 10. And that should be fun, because we get several little stories here coming up as we move forward. So thank you for joining me today. May God bless you and keep you. And so go in peace to love and serve the Lord. And all God's people said, amen.